Good evening, dreamers. The nightmare you are about to experience contains elements of fictional horror events, dark themes, and other intense visions. If you find anything of this nature offensive or unsuitable for you, I suggest leaving this dark dream immediately. For those who wish to stay, welcome to the nightmare.
But seriously, the story contains elements from Halloween Horror Nights and is not recommended for young children or the faint of heart. Also, one final disclaimer, this story is not published anywhere, nor is it anything official from Halloween Horror Nights or Universal Orlando Resort. This story is about a character the park created for their Halloween event. Some of the ideas and elements are based off of the scare zones and houses created for the event, as well as an anthology series published by the Discover Universal podcast. But without further ado, let's begin. The origin story of Dr. Oddfellow, 2023, Prologue. I write this story as a record and a warning to everyone. A malevolent being has risen to a supernatural immortality and will stop at nothing to grow his power until he rules the world. Read this and take heed of his history, as you might be able to find some key to permanently eradicating him. His name is Dr. Rich Oddfellow, 1901, R.J. Bowman's Circus of Oddities. The crowd is raging with adrenaline and excitement as they enter the circus tent. After entering through the open flap, they took their seats in the wooden stadium-style seating that wrapped around an arena in the middle of the red and white striped tent. A dark-skinned boy with long hair sits next to his dad, bubbling with excitement, as he loved the novelty and tricks associated with the circus. The boy was then 11 years old, and his name was Richard Otterman. He was an unassuming boy, just excited to see the circus. R.J. Bowman walked out from behind the curtain to a roar from the crowd, introduced himself, and the show began. A variety of acts comprised the show, including contortionists, and even a lion. After the intermission, where Richard was able to convince his dad to buy another popcorn, Bowman stepped out again and was about to announce the continuation of the show when a massive shape emerged behind him. The dark shape was holding a massive broadsword and plunged it through the back of Bowman to come out his front where his intestinal tract was. Blood sprayed out onto the ground. At first, the crowd thought it was part of the show, until bloody foam began to spill from Bowman's mouth. The person standing behind Bowman pulled out the sword and stepped into the light. He revealed himself to be one of the performers. He then brought the sword down to his mouth and licked the blood off. After doing so, he yelled into the crowd, "I have just killed our oppressor, and you will no longer be able to gawk and stare at us, as we are put on display for being different. Now get out of here, before you come to the same fate as him," he said, as he gave another stab with the sword, this time through Bowman's head. As the attendees all scrambled to get out, and Richard's dad lifted Richard onto his shoulders, Richard realized that he feared death, and never wanted that to happen to him. 1915, Jungle of Doom expedition. For 14 years, Richard searched for a way to escape death. It motivated him, lifted him, and drove him to the deepest, darkest place on the planet Earth. Selva de Perdición, or as it was known by the locals, and when translated, meant Jungle of Doom. Richard landed in South America in a nearby town, then took a jeep out into the jungle. When the growth got too thick, Richard stepped out of the jeep. The air was hot and muggy. The ground was wet and muddy. The air was thick with sounds of bugs and the rustling of the underbrush. After grabbing his pack from the back of the jeep and removing a massive machete, Richard set off into the jungle, hacking the underbrush out of his way as he went. After an hour of travel, he stopped for a rest by a serene pool of water, and stopped to take a swig out of one of his many canteens. So far, he could not see how this place earned the name it did. Then he heard an ethereal cry and looked up to see a massive bird circling above him. The bird then dove straight toward Richard, but instead of just allowing it to kill him, Richard pulled out the machete, and before the bird even realized what was happening, the machete was slicing through its wing. The bird swerved and smashed into a tree. Richard walked over to it. Its head was now dented in, and its skull was shattered from the impact with the tree. The wing spilled a deep blue substance. Richard touched a little of the substance with a gloved hand. It smelled of burning wood, and had the consistency of blood. As for the bird itself, it wasn't really a bird at all. The wingspan was huge, the beak was long and thin and the same leathery feeling material like the rest of the creature. It looked more like a dinosaur than a bird. Richard still had a few hours before nightfall, so he continued deeper. At the rate he was going, he would reach his destination early the next afternoon. After an uneventful 3-hour trek, Richard stopped and unpacked his tent next to a large rock formation. The formation had a little outcropping that would provide some cover. After setting up the canvas tent and foraging for some wood, he built a fire. A little while later, a creature that resembled a small deer came along. After killing and cleaning it, Richard roasted it over the fire. Surprisingly, the meat wasn't too gamey and had a nice smoky hint to it because of the fire. After eating and extinguishing his small campfire, Richard went and wrapped up the remaining meat and placed it in his pack. He then went into the tent and fell asleep. The night was calm, but when Richard awoke the next morning, he heard movement outside his tent. There was a crunching of the leaves and what sounded like a squelching stepping. Then he heard the sound of the embers from the fire being slowly pushed around, and a clicking sound like a bug. So Richard slowly opened the flap at the entrance to the tent. What he saw was odd. The creature appeared to be human in size, but the feet were moist and covered in ooze. The body had cloth covering it, but through the cloth there appeared to be yellowish-orange spikes sticking out. The head was even more bizarre. The creature looked almost like a cabbage, but with mangoes for eyes, and aloe leaves flaring out like a mane around its head. The creature was even more bizarre than the winged creature that had attacked him the previous day. Richard grabbed his machete and lunging in the entrance of the tent, he was ready to strike. He caught the creature off guard and the blade of the machete sliced through its neck. This time an orange-yellow substance, similar to the creature's spines, spilled from its stump of a neck. The creature keeled over and the head rolled away into a nearby bush. Richard then packed up his tent and ate the rest of the creature he roasted last night as he walked. By around what he assumed to be 1, he determined this by using the sun, he arrived at his destination. The sun almost didn't penetrate here, so that's why he didn't know the exact time. The tree canopy was thick with vines hanging down and the underbrush was almost just as thick. But in a clearing where the ground appeared to be scorched loomed a menacing rock pile that was in the shape of a skull. The area was actually illuminated by the eerie green glow that radiated like the rays of the sun from the eyes on the top of the cave. Upon entering, Richard lit his lantern. The cave ahead was dark, but from what he could see, slime covered the walls. He ventured deeper. After what felt like 3 hours, the tunnel opened up into a massive room. The center sat a skull just on a pedestal, like it was waiting for him. The room was circular with a domed ceiling and the walls were covered in symbols, each representing a different zodiac sign. Richard approached the skull. It looked like an ordinary skull, but engraved on the top was a symbol. The symbol consisted of a large circle, a long line running vertically through the center, another line near the top that runs horizontally across with 2 circles on either end, another horizontal line about 3/4 of the way down, 2 diagonal lines traveling from the intersection of the vertical and the top horizontal lines down to cross through a lower horizontal line, and there is another small circle near the intersection of the 2 lower horizontal lines and the right diagonal line. Richard then reached out and touched the skull. He picked it up off the pedestal, and the walls began to glow green. Then glowing, transparent versions of the animals each zodiac sign represents burst from the wall and entered the skull. The room was gone. Richard stood at the top of a dark wooden carriage. Behind him, glowing green bottles lined the bookcases. Richard also didn't recognize the clothes he wore. He had on a straw top hat, a dark blue cloak with gold symbols of the zodiac, a red tailcoat with more gold zodiac signs, a geometric, colorful button-up shirt with a white undershirt and tie matching the cloak. He wore black trousers with the boots that came to just below his knees. Richard also wore white, fingerless gloves, and as for his face, Richard was older. He had a long beard and handlebar mustache. Engraved in his head was the same green glowing symbol that is in the skull, and his left eye is a bright green and swirling. Richard stood on the stage in front of the carriage with thousands of people screaming and yelling at him. He then speaks. Although Richard doesn't hear the words his older self says, but he hears only one thing in the back of his mind. A name. Dr. Oddfellow. 1915 to 1939. The path to immortality. The room was back. Richard was still holding the skull. At this point, the anticipation inside him fuels his desire to find immortality. He quickly turns and walks out of the room. The walk back to the entrance of the cavern seemed to take a matter of 5 minutes. Once out of the cave, Richard removes his pack and places the skull inside, then sets off back in the direction in which he came. Once he got a little way from the skull cave, Richard could see the orange glow illuminating the trees, signaling that the sun was setting, but he trekked on. The excitement of finding the skull made Richard want to get out of the jungle as soon as possible and begin his work on obtaining immortality. The night passes in calm as Richard works his way through the jungle. He heard rustling in the bushes and caught glimpses of more strange creatures, but they all seemed to cower away, as if fearing his presence, or maybe the skulls. By daybreak, he only has about an hour or two more before he reaches the place where he left the jeep he took from the airport. After another hour or so, Richard arrived back at the jeep. Placing his pack in the front seat, he climbs in, starts the vehicle, and drives away from the jungle in a squealing of tires and a cloud of dust. As he drove, Richard thought back to the vision he had when he touched the skull and began to form a plan. But one thing was almost engraved in the back of his own skull. The name the skull had told him. He was no longer Richard Otterman, but from now on would be known as Dr. Oddfellow. After arriving at the airport, taking a plane back to the States, and landing in Texas, Dr. Oddfellow used the name Richard one last time to take money out of his family's bank account. Dr. Oddfellow then began to assemble his outfit. The tailcoat, cloak, gloves, hat, and all the exact details as he saw in the vision. He then crafted the shaft of what would be the portion of what would become the Cane of Souls. After visiting an antique store, Dr. Oddfellow found an old mahogany cane with a gold end, or what seemed like a gold end. After some mild restoration, including a new coat of polish and a real gold end, and some other small adjustments and upgrades, he places the skull on top, and if by some supernatural force the skull attached itself perfectly to the wood and the zodiac signs appeared as if engraved in the wood. Dr. Oddfellow then began to craft his means of gaining immortality. Since, as a kid, he loved the circus, he decided to create a circus of his own and called it Dr. Oddfellow's Carnival of Thrills. The first thing he did was hire some workers to help build and maintain a circus by offering them a chance at immortality. One person by the name of Jack Schmidt stood out in particular, as he was extremely keen to get immortality, but Oddfellow really paid him no mind. After purchasing a van and putting his name and symbol on it, he also bought a ton of wood and other construction supplies for building a circus. Oddfellow and his group of workers traveled to the far west of Kansas to build it. Although he didn't want to wait this long, Oddfellow knew all good things came with patience. So, for the next 24 years, he carefully built and prepared the circus for guests. Oddfellow didn't spend too much time in Kansas, though. He spent his time traveling the world, collecting the oddities his show would hold. Another perk of the skull's power, which, as he gained more immortality, would increase his ability to mask his appearance at will. To travel between countries, he disguised himself as different people. He would have just killed the oddities he met, but to gain his immortality, he needed a large group of people to be sacrificed in a certain way. He shipped many of the oddities to San Francisco, but one night some of them broke free and massacred the dock workers. Luckily, Oddfellow had been overseeing this particular shipment, as it was a large one, and subdued them, but not before many casualties. After many years and much money spent, the circus was ready. Oddfellow created a number of advertisements to draw people in, and draw a crowd it did. The first show was set to begin at 6 p.m., and at 4 p.m. people were already lined up at the ticket booth. The original plan was to begin allowing people in at 5:30, but because of the sheer amount of people, the ticket booths opened at 5. As people approached, they would hear swanky piano music playing, and Dr. Oddfellow's voice over the speakers saying, "Step behind the facade and experience Dr. Oddfellow's Carnival of Thrills." After purchasing their ticket, the attendees walked under an entrance banner sporting the name Oddfellow. They walked through some hanging red and yellow covered hangings where they could hear classic carnival music playing. They then entered the tent to a massive arena in the middle. Everything was going smoothly on the public end, but backstage was a different story, at least for Jack Schmidt and Oddfellow. While the rest of the Oddities were preparing for the show, Jack went to confront Oddfellow. When he found him, Jack accused Oddfellow of being an abusive employer and being unfair to Jack and the rest of the build team and the Oddities. Although none of the others felt this way, Jack threatened to tell the audience that Oddfellow was a sadistic murderer and would kill them all. So Oddfellow fired Jack and told him to leave, or Oddfellow would actually become the murderer Jack falsely accused him of being. Jack left the room in a cloud of rage and vowed to one day return and get back at Oddfellow in one form or another. Promptly at 6, everyone was seated and the lights illuminated the arena dimmed. Oddfellow did a creepy little whistle twice, and his voice filled the room. Fear. I sense it here in this room. Oh, there's no hiding it. He steps out from behind the curtain, and a green glow illuminates him. The cane of souls is in his hand, but other than the green glow coming from the cane, which the crowd can't see because of the lighting, Oddfellow looks like a normal circus performer. I see you, shaking in fear, he says forcefully, and you desire more of it. It is fear that has brought me here, and it can drive you, lift you, take you where you want to be. Tonight I will show you a collection of visions to break your connection with what has defined you. You may have found meaning in a symbol and a sign from the stars, yet I hold these signs in my grasp. 12 people, all dressed in hyper-detailed costumes that look to be crafted of bent, rusted metal, emerge from behind the veil and circle Oddfellow. Each one represents one of the 12 zodiac signs. These creatures you see here before you are from the realm of the dark zodiac, and can take you where you want to go. So keep a close eye for the one that you believe you are connected with, and you may be able to obtain a power you can't even fathom. But now, without further ado, let this horror night begin. Stage goes dark, and then the lights flash to reveal flaming trapeze artists flying through the air, and the show only gets more wild from there. 1939. The first step towards immortality. After the intermission, everyone is seated again. Oddfellow steps out from behind the curtain. He speaks to the crowd, but something is off. No one notices, but there is a powerful aura surrounding him. Do you feel properly terrified? The crowd screams in excitement, but Oddfellow can sense deep down their fear and horror at this show, but their desire to keep watching. The zodiac signs reemerge and circle Oddfellow. There is no spotlight on him now. The only light is the eerie blue glow emitting from the zodiac signs, creatures, and the green glow emanating from the cane. Oddfellow begins to rotate the cane between his fingers, and he begins to chant. The zodiacs have now assembled around me, and the crowd is full of fresh blood and souls. Let this power flow into me, and give me immortality. The zodiac signs begin to lift, and a blue light shining inside of them floods out and forms spheres that, as they approach Oddfellow, turn the same eerie green that the cane of souls emitted. When the orbs entered the cane, green lines appeared on Oddfellow's skin. The same symbol on the cane appeared on his head. Zodiac sign performers fell to the ground and then either floated eerily or stood like their real-life creature counterpart. Oddfellow then pointed his cane towards the audience. The zodiac signs, no longer people but dark creatures, lunged toward the audience and killed them. Blood was spilled everywhere. The souls of the people was what Oddfellow needed, it turned out. When the killing was done, everyone, even the zodiac signs, lay dead. Oddfellow stood in the middle, his skin glowing green. He felt energized and knew he was one step closer to immortality. He decided to leave the scene as it was for a warning to those who came across it, though he burned any signs bearing his name so the massacre could not be traced to him. He entered the tent and surveyed the scene. It's when he heard a noise and turned to see a figure standing in the mouth of the tent. The figure stepped into the light, and it was revealed to be none other than Jack. He looked around and then spoke to Oddfellow. Exactly what I figured. I heard screaming and decided it was worthy of my time to come back and see what happened. Sacrificed, I take it. He said this next part in a deep voice. To feed your immortal power. Oddfellow responded, You could have had this power too, you know. But you decided that I was, and I quote, a narcissistic bastard that kept all the power to himself. If I had stayed, I would have ended up like the rest of them, Jack said angrily as he gestured around the room. You still will. Oddfellow brought the cane up to smash Jack's skull in, but Jack caught it mid-swing and pushed him away. Oddfellow kicked Jack in the stomach before extending a hidden blade within the cane and stabbing Jack through the heart. Oddfellow reached over to push Jack off, and with a little bit of life he had left, Jack reached out and scratched Oddfellow across his face. Oddfellow shoved Jack into a nearby box, but when Oddfellow bent over, some of his blood dripped from the wound on his face onto Jack. Oddfellow slammed the lid shut and locked it. He then left the scene, knowing he had stayed too long after the sacrifice had been finished. People might come wandering over to see what happened. A couple days later, the aftermath. The wind was flapping the unanchored edge of the circus tent. Dawn was hours away, and the show lights were dark. A young vampire approaches the tent. She steps inside, and as she does, the ground crunches under her boots from the amount of blood that dried in the hay. Despite the wind blowing outside, the air was stagnant. It smelled of blood and unkempt creatures. It was very dark inside, and the lantern she held barely illuminated the space, but she could see that the ground was littered with bodies. Most were dressed in normal attire, were obviously the patrons. She noticed that the performers of the circus were odd, and they were obviously meant to terrify the patrons. As she explored the tent, she noticed the zodiac signs and strange symbols that covered the walls. She also noticed that most of the large posters had been destroyed by fire. There was nothing left bearing the name of the owner of the circus. After uncovering all the details she could, she left. Originally, she had come in search of a rogue vampire horde, but realized what she had found was a twisted form of sacrifice, and knew she must continue to look out for more symbols in the future. 1942, a meeting with a vampire. Oddfellow knew he needed the blood this time, as well as the soul, of a very powerful vampire to seal his immortality. Using his power to disguise himself as other people, Oddfellow traveled for years as different people looking for a sign or whisper of where vampires were hiding or meeting. Finally, after years of searching, Oddfellow found a substantial lead as to where he could find a vampire. It was upon arriving in New York where he was following a lead of a brood of vampires when he met Kaisila. When she smiled at him and he smiled back, they noticed the glint of fangs on the other. They turned and said at the same time quietly to each other, Are you a vampire? The two quickly went to Kaisila's nearby apartment, where Oddfellow divulged his made-up story of how he had become a vampire. Oddfellow told such a convincing lie that Kaisila even recommended he present himself before the Vampire Council that was led by a vampire named Olato, whom Kaisila was trying to find when she found Oddfellow's ravaged circus, which she didn't know was his at the time. To gain access as the brood that Olato led was a safe haven for vampires. Kaisila talked to Olato and was able to gain Oddfellow, disguised as a vampire named Erlo Wolf, a meeting with Olato, where Oddfellow explained that he traveled with a circus in the 1930s, when one night it was attacked by vampires. When he awoke, he began his transformation. He then explained his experience when Olato asked for it, and again told it so convincingly that Olato believed him. Oddfellow was then admitted into the brood and spent the next few years together with this group. 1968, the Vampire Council of 1968. It had been over 25 years since Oddfellow had joined the brood. They still had not been let out to the streets to feed, and Oddfellow was growing less restless. He needed souls plus Olato's power. It would be suspicious if a vampire just randomly disappeared from the group. He requested to present himself before the council in 1968. Olato lifts himself from the massive mahogany seat, so his head almost touches the ceiling. The candlelight that illuminated the dingy New York City basement exaggerates Olato's movements. The entire room of vampires is silent. The only sound is the drip of water. The firelight that reflects in Olato's eyes is aimed at Oddfellow, disguised as Erlo Wolf. Oddfellow is unaffected by Olato's intimidations and speaks. You know how I turned and became a vampire. I'm a child compared to you. I'm growing. strengthening. But you're satiated. I don't see the bloodlust I saw in you the night we met in 1938, the night your horde attacked our circus. I saw the blood frenzy of ferocious vampires toying with their victims and reveling like children in rain puddles. I remember you holding down one victim while you finished off another, as if your thirst couldn't wait. You may have had your fill, but there are those of us who long to let our power free and drink to our heart's content. You speak of our strength, and you gloat about our history, but not all of you are as privileged to be in your seat and have all they wish. Let us free. Let us feed. Oddfellow had changed his original lie in a calculated fashion to appeal to Olado's emotions, and allow them to feed on the streets above. But Oddfellow had also overstepped his place and let a little green flash come out of his skin. But it appeared no one noticed, as they were all waiting for Olado's reaction. Ollado responds, "You are a child, crying like the child for the breast, pleading that we leave our hiding and feed on the bustling streets. And like a child, you are so very ignorant. I have never been satiated, and you will never question me again, Earl Wolf. I should rip you apart. But I admire your passion. Indeed, we will feast again, and soon." Oddfellow sits back down and surveys the crowd. He had achieved the effect he wanted. He then locks eyes with Kaisila. She's studying him, and he wondered if she noticed a little outburst of power. 1969, the music festival. Oddfellow's speech had convinced Ollado to allow the brood to feed on the upcoming music festival, and after months of planning, it was time. When the band began to play, the vampires rushed out onto the streets and began to feed. Oddfellow ran around acting as though he was feeding, but really he was killing the people and extracting their souls with his cane, which was hidden in his cloak. He even killed a few of the vampires, which sealed his immortality further. But if he wanted to unlock his full potential, he needed the blood, soul, a very powerful vampire, sacrificed on the night of a blood moon, which just so happened to be that night. As the night went on, the streets ran with blood. Ollado had stepped off to the side for a minute, so Oddfellow made his move. He quickly knocked Ollado out with a frying pan by hitting him over the head with it. Oddfellow then dragged Ollado into a greenhouse where he then bound Ollado to the table, transformed himself from Earl Wolf back to Dr. Oddfellow, began to prepare for the ritual. When Ollado awoke, he saw a figure standing above him and he spoke. "I should have known you weren't a vampire," Oddfellow responded. "What gave it away?" "When you attacked your victims, you never lowered your head to their neck. You just reached in your cloak, presumably for whatever's casting that green glow. This? It's called the Cane of Souls. And now your soul will be mine." Oddfellow pulled the skull off the cane to reveal an ornamental dagger covered in the zodiac signs, then slit Olado's throat, and the blood ran through the grooves in the dagger, and were absorbed into the skull. Oddfellow placed the skull back on the cane, before creating a 20-foot deep hole in the earth, unceremoniously threw Olado's body inside. The blood moon's glow cast over Oddfellow, and he felt a power rise up in him. He now had a purpose, to collect souls to feed his immortality, and he knew just how to do that. 1999. Jack is back. It was a cool, blustery evening in New York, and Kaisila walked the streets as the crowd of the music festival partied around her. It had been 30 years since that day in 1969, when Earlo convinced Ollado to allow their horde to feast and ravage the music festival. So on that very fateful night, that both Earlo and Ollado had gone missing. Suddenly she felt a cold wash over her that had nothing to do with the weather. This cold was the same feeling she got when Earlo had spoken very passionately to Ollado, the council, about letting them feed. That was when a few wisps of green light appeared around Earlo. Kaisila turned and saw a person wearing a similar trench coat to Earlo, and he was holding a cane with a skull on top that was emitting the same green light that Earlo had. As she approached, Kaisila saw the same symbol she saw engraved on the wall 60 years ago at the ravaged circus. When she arrived at the stranger, she asked,
Who are you, and where did you get that cane?
The stranger responded, "I'm Jack the Clown, and I got this from killing my former boss. What is it to you?"
Did your boss own a circus that was traveling across the Dust Bowl in the late 1930s?
Jack looked at her quizzically. "How did you know?"
I was searching for a rogue vampire horde and heard a massive slaughter at a circus. I thought it was them, but when I arrived, I found a scene that looked like a ritual sacrifice. It didn't say long, just quickly gathered some details and left.
When she finished, Jack let out a long sigh and spoke. "It was the night of the first show, and he was planning on sacrificing the audience and performers to gain immortality. Called him out on it backstage. We got into an argument. I left but didn't go far. An hour or so later, I heard screams coming from the tent, and I hurried back to see if I could stop the psycho. When I got to the tent, he had already killed everyone and was about to erase any mark that was connected to the circus. I attacked him, and he stabbed me. As he was about to shove me in a box, I scratched his face, and his immortal blood dripped onto me. He locked me in that box where I was barely alive. Eventually, some people came by, and as they were cleaning up the scene, they let me out of the box. Spent the last 60 years trying to track him down. He needed the blood of a very powerful vampire to seal his immortality. He can change his appearance at will. Only just a couple months ago, I found him and killed him using a special dagger that can supposedly kill immortals."
What was his name?
"Dr. Oddfellow."
I think I met him. A person named Erlo came among us. Both him and our leader disappeared when we ravaged this music festival 30 years ago on this day. I now believe they are the same person.
At that moment, the square fell silent. A shout could be heard. "Jack!" Oddfellow stepped out from behind the crowd and stabbed Jack with an ornamental dagger. Oddfellow grabbed the cane, winked at Kaisela, and walked off. Oddfellow had been resurrected not but a couple hours earlier by a group of his loyal followers. He had been bound to the Zodiac realm when Jack killed him. Oddfellow could only be set free during a ritual with a specific metal found in the cave where the skull on the cane came from. Metal had to be shaped like the zodiac signs, and the ritual must be performed on dusk of a rising blood moon. 2023, Halloween Horror Nights, 32. The stage had been set. This was the biggest horror event in the world, and Oddfellow saw this as the best way to collect souls. He brought together some of the biggest names in horror, as well as some of his own creations for this event. As he climbed the truss that had been constructed for him to welcome in the crowds, he heard the roar of them, smelled their anticipation, their excitement, but most of all, their fear. It was intoxicating. He arrived at the top, and the wind whipped across his face. He stood obscured at the end until he was given the all-clear to begin. He whistled his creepy whistle twice and walked out. He stopped in the middle and stood at the railing, surveying the crowd. They were screaming in excitement. All those fresh souls were about to be his. "Hear my voice, Halloween Horror Nights." His voice covered the crowd like a hot shadow, aided by the speaker system and mic. "I am Dr. Oddfellow. I've been watching you. For years I've seen you shaking in fear. You're begging for more." He laughed, and the crowd screamed even louder. "You practically worship those who stood here before me. Doctors, directors, even clowns." He enunciated the last word and laughed menacingly. "Oh, but I don't want your worship." "No, I want what you want. So what is that? Fear? Horror? I promise these will unhinge your souls to prepare you for something more. Power. Immortality. That is what I offer you. Enter now, as this horror night begins." The gates open and the crowd rushes in. They are excited to get in and find out what lays beyond. Kaisela stands overwhelmed at the massive bodies swarming around her. Oddfellow steps out. He speaks to the crowd, promising immortality. When he finishes, the gates open. The crowd rushes in, but Kaisela stays put. A battle raging in her mind. Part of her mind has been hearing Oddfellow's call, urging her to go in and join the deviant masses. The other part screams that she is already immortal and doesn't need Dr. Oddfellow or the lies that he promises. She begins to shake and collapses. She begins to crawl away, and as she does so, one thought rings in her mind. Oddfellow is above the expectation. He is nothing like the ringmaster Jack described, or Earl Wolf. He emitted a power unlike she had ever known. She rushed home and wrote a letter to her father, explaining her situation and history with Oddfellow. All the while, Oddfellow's power is sapping her strength and drawing her back to him and the event. Meanwhile, Oddfellow is holding a speech for the press. He enters the room. Fear. I sense it here in this room. Oh, there's no hiding it. I see you, shaking in fear. You're begging for more. And if it's more that you want, then surely there's something I could do for you. Most people try to avoid the dark. I like to show them what's inside it. You practically worship those who stood here before me. Doctors, directors, even clowns. Oh, but I don't want your worship. No, I want what you want. You desire fear. Good. You want to feel its power. You long for immortality. I offer all of that and more. For a grand price, of course. What does it take to be amongst my collection of souls? Why, your very soul indeed. A fair price to Dr. Oddfellow, don't you think? Out there is a look into my past that will show you your future. Your destiny awaits. Enter now, as this horror night begins. The crowd cheers, and Oddfellow says over his shoulder as he walks out of the room, Break the weak. Take your wish. I'll handle the rest. Not particularly talking to the crowd. 2023, Epilogue. For 46 nights, Oddfellow did his opening speech. For 46 nights, every person that attended was killed by the end of the night. Each morning, after the killings, everything was cleaned up. It happened again the next night. Tonight is the last night of the event, and as I sit here in my office in the Universal Orlando backlot, with the windows open, listening to the music and screams coming from the event, I wonder, will Dr. Oddfellow return for another year? Will Jack find a way to come back? Is Caecilla still alive? And will I survive this final night of HHN? Or will he come for my soul next? Is that the soft tread of boots on the floor? Is that the whistle coming from the park or right outside my door? So many questions left to answer. This was Oddfellow's past, and his future, at the current time, looks just as violent. So I leave you with this question. Is Dr. Oddfellow's future as twisted as his origins?